Rain hammered against the cracked asphalt like an endless drumbeat, drowning out every thought that tried to form in her head. Isabella Hart clutched her coat tighter around her trembling body, though the thin fabric was soaked through long ago. Her shoes were ruined, each step squishing miserably in the rising puddles, and her vision blurred from water clinging stubbornly to her lashes. The storm had come out of nowhere, swallowing the night whole, and with her car stranded on the roadside, its engine hissing like a wounded animal, she had no choice but to keep moving. Her phone was dead, of course. It had been flashing warnings about low battery all evening, but she had ignored it, assuming she would be home before the skies turned violent. Now she was stranded in the middle of an unfamiliar district, far from the safety of her modest apartment, and the streets stretched out like black veins under the storm. Lightning ripped across the heavens, illuminating a set of iron gates in the distance. Isabella slowed her pulse, thrumming painfully in her ears. Beyond those gates loomed a mansion vast and commanding, its outlines stark against the storm. For one desperate moment she thought it must be abandoned. No sane person would live in such an isolated palatial estate on the edge of the city. But the faint glow of golden lights behind the curtained windows told her otherwise. The gates stood ajar, swaying with each gust of wind, as if inviting her inside. Her better judgment screamed at her to stay away, to keep walking until she found a gas station or some semblance of civilization. Yet the storm was merciless, and her body was reaching its breaking point. With one last glance over her shoulder at the endless rain-slashed road, Isabella stepped through. The driveway was lined with ancient oaks, their branches clawing at the sky. Pools of water gathered in the dips of the cobblestones, reflecting the lightning like shards of glass. The closer she moved toward the mansion, the more she felt the weight of its presence pressing against her chest. It was beautiful, yes, grand in a way she had only ever seen in films or glossy magazines. But there was something unsettling, too. A silence beneath the roar of the storm, as though the house itself was holding its breath. She climbed the marble steps, her soaked shoes slipping dangerously, and raised a trembling hand to knock. The carved wooden doors towered over her, their surface etched with elaborate patterns of lions, roses, and crowns. Just as her knuckles brushed the surface, the door swung open with a groan that echoed into the cavernous space beyond. Warmth spilled out, carrying the faint aroma of leather and cedar smoke. She hesitated on the threshold, her breath catching in her throat. The foyer was enormous, its floors gleaming like liquid obsidian, a chandelier dripping with crystals swaying faintly overhead. Twin staircases curled upward in opposite directions, like the arms of a serpent leading to shadows above. And then she saw him. He stood at the base of the staircase, as though he had been waiting all along. Tall, broad-shouldered, and perfectly still, he wore a dark suit that fit him like a second skin, the fabric catching the glimmer of the chandelier. His hair was black as midnight, slicked back in deliberate precision, and his face, sharp lines carved with an artist's cruelty. Cheekbones, high jaw, firm lips pressed into a line of silent command. But it was his eyes that rooted Isabella in place, gray, cold, metallic, like storm clouds before a strike. Lost. His voice was deep, resonant, rolling across the marble floor like distant thunder. Isabella swallowed, suddenly aware of how drenched and fragile she looked under his gaze. I'm sorry, she stammered, her voice catching. My car broke down. The storm. I didn't know where else to go. For a long moment he said nothing. His gaze swept over her from head to toe, unreadable, as if he were cataloguing every detail, every weakness. Then slowly he stepped forward. Each stride was measured predatory, the sound of polished shoes against marble, magnified in the silence. "You shouldn't be here," he said at last, though his tone was not one of anger. If anything, it carried a note of intrigue, as though her presence were an unexpected puzzle. "I'll leave as soon as the rain stops," Isabella offered quickly, clutching her bag to her chest. "I don't mean to intrude. I just needed shelter." Another pause, then the faintest curve of his mouth, not quite a smile, but something colder, sharper. "Shelter," he repeated softly, as though tasting the word. "Do you even know whose home you've walked into?" Her heart stumbled. She shook her head, unable to form words. He moved closer still until the storm was a muffled whisper behind the shut doors, and the only reality was him, the man who filled the mansion with his presence. "Lorenzo De Luca," he said finally, his voice a declaration that seemed to reverberate off the walls. "And you little trespasser have just stepped into the house of a man you should never have found." Lightning cracked outside, throwing his shadow long and jagged across the marble floor. Isabella's breath hitched. She knew the name whispered in late-night news reports, murmured in cautious tones by strangers in the city. De Luca. A name tied to wealth so vast it dwarfed comprehension, but also to rumors of power bought not with honesty, but with blood. And yet as fear slithered into her veins, another sensation rose too, an inexplicable pull, a magnetic draw she couldn't understand. Standing there drenched and trembling, Isabella realized that fate had not simply brought her to shelter from a storm. It had led her to the gates of something far darker, far more dangerous than she could ever imagine. The door closed behind Isabella, with a soft thud, muffling the violence of the storm until it was nothing more than a distant roar. The silence that replaced it was worse, thick, heavy, and alive with unspoken tension. Lorenzo De Luca's gaze never left her, those grey eyes cutting through her as though searching for secrets she hadn't yet spoken aloud. "Come," he said at last. The word held no warmth, no hint of courtesy. It was not an invitation, but a command. Isabella hesitated on the polished marble, her shoes leaving damp prints that felt like evidence of a crime. She wasn't sure what crime, but in his house, even breathing felt dangerous. She followed him cautious, clutching her bag close to her chest like a shield. They passed through a grand corridor lined with portraits, men and women painted in oil, their gazes watchful, almost accusatory. She recognized the resemblance, the same sharp features, the same storm-colored eyes. Generations of De Lucas watching her trespass. The hallway opened into a study that might have belonged to another century. Bookshelves climbed toward the ceiling, sagging with leather-bound volumes. The fire in the massive stone hearth crackled, casting flickering shadows across walls paneled in dark oak. A scent lingered in the air, smoke-old paper, and something metallic beneath it all. Lorenzo gestured toward a high-backed chair near the fire. "Sit." Her legs obeyed before her mind could argue. The warmth of the flames seeped into her frozen body, but it did little to quiet the storm inside her chest. She watched him as he crossed the room, pouring amber liquid from a crystal decanter into 2 glasses. His movements were controlled, deliberate, every gesture radiating authority. "Drink." He handed her the glass. "I don't usually drink." The steel in his voice left no room for refusal. She sipped. The burn of whiskey licked down her throat, hot and sharp. It made her cough, and for the first time his expression shifted barely, but enough. The corner of his mouth twitched, not in mockery, but in something dangerously close to amusement. "Who are you?" he asked. "Isabella Hart." Her voice sounded small in the cavernous room. I live downtown. I work at a cafe. I didn't mean to intrude, I swear. My car broke down in the storm, I know." He cut her off with a flick of his hand as though explanations bored him. "I can see it in your eyes, you're not lying. But do you understand where you are, Isabella Hart?" Her lips parted, but she hesitated. The truth was she did understand. Not fully, not in detail, but enough. She had heard the whispers about him, a man whose fortune was built not on boardroom deals alone, but on shadows, on debts and loyalty paid in blood. A man whose name opened doors in the city and slammed others shut forever. "This is your home," she said carefully. "Lorenzo De Luca's home." He tilted his head, regarding her as if she were a puzzle piece he hadn't expected to find. "Most people would have turned back the moment they saw my gates. I didn't have a choice. There is always a choice." His voice softened, but it was no less dangerous for it. The fire popped, sending sparks into the air. Isabella wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold, despite the blaze. She wanted to leave, to run back into the storm, but her body betrayed her. She was rooted, bound by something invisible. Fear, yes, but also curiosity. Lorenzo leaned against the edge of his desk, swirling the whiskey in his glass. The light caught on the liquid, turning it to molten gold. "You've stumbled into a world you don't belong to. A storm outside is nothing compared to the storms inside these walls." Her pulse spiked. "Then why let me in?" He studied her in silence for a long moment. Then, "Because I wanted to see what you would do." The admission unsettled her more than any threat could have. She realized then that she was not simply a trespasser or a guest. She was a test, a game. And Lorenzo De Luca was a man who never played games without consequence. The clock on the mantel struck midnight, each chime reverberating through the chamber. Isabella flinched, and Lorenzo's gaze sharpened at the sound, as though time itself were a predator drawing near. Finally, he set his glass down with a decisive click. "You may stay for the night. The storm is not kind, and I have no use for corpses on my doorstep." Relief rushed through her, but it was short-lived. "But know this," he added, stepping closer until the shadows seemed to follow him. "No one enters my house without debt, and debts Isabella Hart must always be paid." Her heart thundered in her chest, drowning out the fire, the storm, the ticking clock. She didn't know what debt he meant or how he intended her to pay it, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty: her life had changed the moment she crossed his gates. And she feared it was too late to turn back. A draft of heat ghosted across Isabella's skin as the fire shifted, but it didn't quiet the thrum beneath her ribs. Lorenzo De Luca had the kind of presence that repopulated a room even when he stood motionless. He didn't have to loom. The house did it for him. The chandelier, the tall shelves, the portraits. All of it seemed to lean toward him like iron to a magnet. "Debts," she repeated softly, testing the word he had left between them. "What do you want?" His gaze held hers a beat too long. "We'll get there." He lifted a small brass bell from the desk and tapped it once. Somewhere beyond the oak-paneled walls a mechanism clicked. Footsteps approached, measured soundless in the way only trained steps were soundless. A man appeared in the doorway, broad-shouldered dark suit and earpiece glinting where the fire caught it. He looked carved from the same stone as the house, Matteo Lorenzo said, without looking away from Isabella. Miss Hart needs a guest room prepared, a hot shower, dry clothing, and call Domenico. Her car is on the old service road. I want it inside before dawn. Yes, sir. Matteo's eyes flicked to Isabella, assessing weighing, then slid away as if she'd been filed. Lorenzo moved to a cabinet and drew out a square of black silk. He offered it to her. Your hands are shaking. They were. She hadn't noticed until the silk revealed the tremor. She clenched her fingers around the fabric, focusing on the weave, the fine pattern that had no right to exist in a practical world. Thank you. You'll stay in the East Wing, he said. Second floor. Matteo will take you. Eat something. Warm yourself. Sleep. And in the morning she asked. The storm had begun to withdraw into a sullen hiss at the edges of the mansion, but the question made it return full force inside her. In the morning we talk about payment. She swallowed. What if I say no? A ghost of something amusement warning touched his mouth. You're asking the wrong question. Ask instead what the debt buys you. What does it buy me? Safety, he said simply. Then, after a beat, and answers. He turned away as if the matter were settled. Matteo stepped forward, his hand guiding without touching. Isabella hesitated, then followed. At the doorway, she glanced back, compelled by a force she didn't trust. Lorenzo stood with his back to the fire, a figure cut out of light and shadow. He raised his glass in a gesture that might have been a toast, or a promise. The corridor beyond the study swallowed sound. Sconces burned low pools of gold along the long runner. The storm made the stained glass windows flicker, as if the saints themselves were breathing. They passed a music room, a piano half lit by the fire's stray reflections, a gallery with marble figures that watched through milky eyes. A small chapel tucked into a corner, its door half open as if someone had just slipped out. You live here, Isabella murmured, more to the house than to Matteo. It feels occupied, even when it's empty. Matteo didn't answer. He stopped at a door in the east wing and opened it, motioning her inside. Warm light, a bed like a cloud, a bathroom spraying steam into the air, as if the room itself exhaled relief. On a chair lay a folded sweater, soft and pearl gray, and a pair of drawstring pants that promised mercy. There's soup on the tray, Matteo said. Someone will be outside if you need anything. Someone, she echoed. Always. He didn't smile. Always. When he left, the silence felt different. Not heavy, but attentive. Isabella touched the sweater. It was finer than anything she'd ever owned, and set it aside long enough to step into the bathroom. The hot water found every knot the storm had knotted into her muscles, and undid them one by one. It felt like giving in. It felt like remembered safety. She let herself breathe. Under the spray, her mind replayed the night in fragments, iron gates, yawning portraits, watching gray eyes that never flinched. You shouldn't be here. There is always a choice. Debts. She pressed her forehead to the tile. Why had he let her in? Why not send her back into the rain? And why offer shelter with one hand and threaten obligation with the other? She toweled off, pulled on the sweater and pants, and padded barefoot to the small table by the window. The soup was simple broth-sliced carrots, tender shreds of chicken, and precisely what her body needed. She ate until the ache in her fingers receded, and the world regained edges. She found a note beneath the tray, written in a spare, angular hand. Rest. L. A smaller line beneath it, as if added after a pause, east wing doors lock from the inside. Use the deadbolt. She looked up. The bedroom door had a serious piece of hardware sunk into the wood. She rose, tested it, and heard the sure slide of metal into metal. The small satisfaction steadied her breath. If the house was a creature, at least this room was a ribcage that could close. Isabella drew the curtains. Outside, the storm had thinned to a silk of rain. Somewhere far along the drive, headlights moved briefly like an eye, opening and closing. The bedsheets were cool, then warm almost instantly. She lay on her side, palms tucked under her cheek, and stared at the door until the shape of it softened. Sleep took her cleanly. She woke to quiet and a low gray light that made the room look like a still from a black-and-white film. For a second, she didn't know where she was. Then the smell of cedar and beeswax, the weight of the sweater, the crisp sheet against her ankle put the pieces back. A tray had replaced the soup, coffee, pale toast, a small dish of blackberry jam, and a boiled egg. A folded card leaned against the pot. Mateo's name in that same spare hand. 11 o'clock. The study. It was 10:20 when Isabella found the courage to look at the mirror. The woman in it was pale but composed hair braided back in a line she could pretend looked intentional. She slid the deadbolt with a small click and stepped into the hall. No one waited outside, yet the sensation of being noticed did not diminish. The study door was open. The fire was small or steady. Lorenzo stood at the window with his jacket off and his sleeves rolled to the forearm, hands in his pockets. Posture unyielding, even as he seemed to study the wet world beyond the glass. Without the jacket, he was less monumental, and more human, wasn't the word. Immediate. The line of a scar nicked the inside of his wrist, a pale crescent mostly hidden by the cuff. He turned as if he had sensed her at the threshold. Perhaps he had. Miss Hart. Mr. De Luca. Coffee. I already thank you. Yes. She accepted the cup he poured, grateful to anchor her fingers around something that made sense. He didn't sit behind the desk. He took the chair opposite hers and leaned back, balanced the way a predator might pretend to rest. Your car is on the property, he said. Domenico will call the mechanic we use. It can be seen to by this afternoon. Thank you, she said. The words felt thin for the magnitude of the favor. I can pay. You will? He said mildly. Not with money. Before she could ask, he continued. You told me last night the storm drove you to my door. I chose to let you in. Those are the facts. Now we talk about the cost. Her fingers tightened around the cup. What do you want? His eyes held steady. Presents. Presents. At a dinner, he said. Tonight. She blinked. You want me to attend a dinner? I want you, he said, the pronoun landing with a weight that made her pulse misstep to sit at my table. Answer when asked your name and leave when I tell you to leave. That's all. For the moment. The room seemed to breathe. Why me? Because you are no one. Anyone here knows he said plainly. Because your presence will unsettle those who think they understand my habits. Because they will ask themselves what it means that I've brought someone I have not announced. A bluff, she said before she could stop herself. An arrangement, he corrected. A conversation in another language. Whose language? He smiled, and the expression did something to the air. Power is dialect. She looked into her coffee as if the surface might offer refraction enough to see where the ground was. I don't belong in your world. You belonged under my roof last night. That was weather. He tipped his head, granting the point and refusing it in the same motion. Weather exposes structure. She set the cup down with care. What happens if I say no? He didn't soften the answer. You'll still eat breakfast. Your car will still be repaired. And you will leave with the understanding that there are places in this city where doors will not open for you again. A chill brushed the base of her skull. Threats. Predictions. The word was gentle and somehow more frightening. Miss Hart, people are fond of believing in chance. But what we do with chance, that is ledger work. I'm offering you a clean entry. You pay a portion of last night's debt by sitting in a chair and pretending you have always known how to lift a crystal glass. You go home this evening with your car safe, and with an answer for a question you haven't yet asked aloud. What answer? Why I opened the door. The clock ticked. The fire breathed. Isabella found that she could hear the rain moving through the gutters, busy, efficient, unconcerned with human bargains. She looked up. What would I have to be? She asked. At your table. Present, he said again. Attentive. Unafraid to keep your eyes on mine when others try to take them. A pause. Untouchable. Untouchable how you will wear something I send, he said, as if they were discussing the weather's return. Simple. You will arrive on my arm. You will smile if you wish to smile. You will not drink what you do not wish to drink. And if anyone addresses you without my permission, you will look at me. I'll do the rest. It was absurd that the rules calmed her. It was more absurd that the last one loosened something tight in her chest. Why me? She said again, because the question had too many edges for one answer. One shoulder lifted a fraction. Because when I told you there is always a choice, you didn't argue the philosophy. You argued the weather. She blinked. That's not an answer. It's the only kind I ever give. Silence settled. Not empty, but truer. He studied her face. She tried not to study the scar at his wrist, the way his shirt had creased where he'd rolled it, the faint shadow at his jaw that said he'd shaved at an hour when most men were still asleep. Agreed, she heard herself say. A single nod. No triumph. Only acknowledgement of a line crossed. Matteo will arrange everything. 6 o'clock. Where? Here. His mouth curved cool as the rim of a glass. It is not a dinner where people come to be fed. They come to be measured. For what? For whether they belong in rooms where outcomes are decided. She rose because staying seated felt like admitting something she didn't have language for. He stood as well. He did that, met her in small, precise ways that acknowledged her and controlled the moment in the same breath. One more thing he said, moving to a small drawer. He took out a narrow bracelet of matte steel, delicate as a line of punctuation. Wear this. She lifted it. It was warm from his hand, surprisingly light. What is it? Consider it a key, he said. To doors in this house that like you more when you're expected. You mean a tracker. I mean, he said, patient and implacable, that there are corners of the world where being found quickly is the difference between gratitude and regret. Isabella hesitated, then slid the bracelet over her wrist. It settled as if the metal had learned her skin. She imagined the wing doors that would open, the elevators that would hum instead of halt, the eyes in suits that would look and then look away. "Miss Hart," he said, and her name had the shape of a vow on his tongue. "You pay a debt tonight. I keep a promise. What promise? That no harm touches you while you are under my roof." "A beat, or my name." The words landed like a seal pressed into wax. For the first time since the gates had swung wide, a different fear stirred, quieter, more dangerous, the fear of what it would mean to want that seal to hold. Matteo appeared in the doorway as if summoned by the thought. "Sir," he said, "everything is ready." Lorenzo's gaze didn't leave Isabella's. "6," he repeated. "Don't be late." She nodded. Matteo stepped aside. She moved past him into the corridor that now seemed shorter, brighter, as if the house had shifted on its foundations to make room for a new equation. Halfway to the east wing, she glanced at the bracelet. It glinted like a small moon on her wrist. Behind her, the study door clicked. Somewhere deeper in the mansion, a phone rang and was lifted on the first chime. A voice spoke in a language the rain did not understand. Isabella paused at a window. The storm had finally blown itself out. The sky was the color of pewter, and the lawn shone like glass. Far down the drive, figures moved in patterns that looked accidental until you watched long enough to see the design. Debts and promises, she thought. Ledger work. She pressed her palm to the cold pane as if the glass could give her an answer before the night did. It gave her only her reflection, smaller than the house, smaller than its master's shadow, and steadier than she had been when she arrived. At 6, she would walk into a room where outcomes were decided, and she would have to become, for the length of a dinner, a woman no storm could move. She turned from the window and went to learn how to be her. By the time the mansion's grandfather clock tolled 6, the east wing no longer felt like a sanctuary. Isabella had dressed in silence, guided by the careful precision of a garment box delivered hours earlier. Inside, folded in layers of tissue, had been a gown the color of midnight ink. The fabric flowed like water when she slipped it over her body, clinging where it ought to, veiling where it must. It wasn't flashy. It was deliberate, designed to command attention without screaming for it. On the vanity had rested a single velvet case. Inside, a necklace of black pearls, their sheen subdued but dangerous like storm clouds over the sea. She hadn't wanted to wear it. She had fastened it anyway. Now, standing outside the study door, she felt the weight of the pearls pressing at her collarbone like a reminder. The door opened before she could knock. Matteo stood there, immaculate as ever, but with a small flicker of approval in his eyes. He inclined his head and gestured inside. Lorenzo was waiting. He wore a suit cut so cleanly it could have been a blade, the tie a narrow strip of shadow. Without the storm to frame him, he looked even sharper, as though the absence of chaos outside had sharpened the chaos he carried within. His eyes traveled the length of her gown, once lingering not on the curve of her body, but on the way she carried it. When his gaze returned to her face, his expression gave nothing away. "Good," he said simply. She wanted to ask good for what, but the words died when he extended his arm. "Shall we?" Her fingers hovered above the fabric of his sleeve, hesitant. Then she set them down light as a whisper. His arm was solid beneath unyielding. They walked together through the corridor, their footsteps echoing in tandem. Portraits loomed above them, saints and sinners, all their oil-painted eyes following like witnesses. The smell of roasted meats and wine drifted from somewhere ahead, weaving into the low murmur of voices. The dining hall revealed itself with the slow drama of a curtain drawn back. A long mahogany table gleamed beneath the light of a crystal chandelier. Silverware caught the firelight like weapons arranged for a feast. Around the table, guests turned their heads as one. Isabella felt the weight of their stares. Men in tailored suits, women in gowns cut with lethal elegance, faces painted in the neutral masks of power. None of them smiled. Lorenzo guided her to the head of the table. Chairs scraped as the room adjusted a subtle acknowledgement of his arrival. He did not sit immediately. He let the silence stretch. Only after every gaze had settled did he lower himself into the high-backed chair. Isabella followed her movements, slow, precise, as if the wrong gesture might shatter porcelain. A server poured wine into crystal goblets. The ruby liquid caught the light, gleaming like blood. Isabella wrapped her fingers around the stem, steadying them with effort. Conversation resumed in fragments, hushed enough that she caught only threads, territories, shipments, names of men she had never heard but sensed she should. Every so often a guest's gaze flicked toward her, then away again as though she were a cipher they had yet to decode. The man seated 2 chairs down broke the pattern. Heavy-set, his gold ring flashed each time he lifted his glass. He leaned forward, directing his voice across the table. "And who is this?" His tone was silk stretched too thin. Isabella froze. She remembered Lorenzo's instruction. "If anyone addresses you without my permission, look at me." She turned her head. Lorenzo's eyes were already on her, calm, unreadable. This he said, his voice carrying without effort, "is Miss Hart. She is here because I chose it." The heavy-set man's lips curled. "Chosen for what, if I may ask?" "You may not." Lorenzo's reply was soft, almost gentle, but it ended the matter like a blade. A ripple moved around the table. Acknowledgement tension, something between respect and fear. Isabella exhaled slowly, realizing she had been holding her breath. The courses arrived one after another, each plated like art carpaccio, glistening with oil lamb so tender it gave way under the knife-delicate pastries that melted like secrets. Isabella forced herself to eat, to chew, to sip wine without letting it overwhelm her. Midway through the meal, a woman across the table leaned in her gown, a dark scarlet, her hair pinned in an intricate knot. Her smile was a curve of polished steel. "You must forgive us, Miss Hart," she said. "It isn't often Lorenzo brings company." Isabella lifted her glass, her pulse a steady drum. "Then I suppose tonight is unusual for us all?" A small, deliberate silence followed. Then unexpectedly Lorenzo's mouth curved not into warmth, but into approval. The woman across the table lowered her eyes, her smile unchanged, but thinner at the edges. The rest of the dinner passed in waves of coded exchanges Isabella couldn't fully follow but could sense the weight of. Every laugh that wasn't laughter, every toast that wasn't about wine. She learned quickly to measure silence as carefully as speech. At last the final course was cleared and Lorenzo rose. So did the room. Isabella followed steady on her feet, though her heart was still racing. "Gentlemen, ladies," Lorenzo said. "A productive evening." No one lingered. They departed with the same choreographed precision they had arrived, leaving the hall echoing with the absence of voices. When the last door shut, Isabella let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Her hand slipped from Lorenzo's arm, fingers tingling from the grip they had maintained all night. That she whispered wasn't dinner. That was war in disguise. Lorenzo looked at her, then his eyes sharp with something like admiration. "You're learning." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "And you wore the mask well." The pearls at her collar seemed heavier now, as though they had absorbed the weight of every gaze. Isabella straightened her spine, meeting him head-on. "So what debt have I paid tonight?" His answer was quiet, dangerous. The first installment. The house was quieter than the night before. The storm had gone, leaving the air strangely hollow, as if the walls were holding their breath. Isabella walked beside Lorenzo through a corridor lit by dim sconces, her gown whispering against the marble floor. She could still feel the weight of every stare from the dinner table pressing against her skin, lingering long after the guests had vanished. When they reached the base of the grand staircase, Lorenzo paused. He didn't release her arm right away. His eyes searched hers, gray and unreadable. "You held your ground. I followed the rules," she replied. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. "That's more than most can manage." He let go, but the absence of his hand felt louder than the silence that filled the hall. Matteo appeared from a side passage. He bowed his head slightly. "Sir, a call is waiting." Lorenzo's jaw tightened. "Not now. It's urgent," Matteo said. His tone carried an edge Isabella hadn't heard before. For a moment, Lorenzo's gaze sharpened like glass catching the light. Then he nodded once. "The study." He turned back to Isabella. "Go upstairs. Rest. I'll send for you in the morning." The words were final, but his eyes lingered as though reluctant to dismiss her. Then he was gone, his stride swift and soundless, Matteo following close behind. Alone, Isabella ascended the staircase. The pearls at her collar felt like a leash she couldn't unfasten. Each step echoed through the hollow mansion, carrying her into the east wing where the air was cooler, more secretive. In her room, she peeled the gown away, replaced it with the sweater left for her the night before. She should have felt relief. Instead, she felt the gnawing pulse of curiosity. What kind of call could shift a man like Lorenzo from calm command to clenched jaw? The house was not asleep. She heard it in the creaks of the floorboards, in the distant murmur of voices too low to make out. She pressed her ear against the cool wood of her door, straining. A word slipped through sharp foreign accented in the language of violence. Then silence. Isabella retreated to the window, her eyes tracing the drive below. Headlights cut across the gravel. 2 black cars' engines idling, doors opening. Figures moved quickly, shadows swallowed by the trees. The night carried them away, and the house returned to stillness. She should have gone back to bed. Instead, she moved to the desk where another note awaited her. This one was shorter ink, darker, written in the same spare hand as before. "Stay inside tonight. Do not open the door." Her fingers trembled around the paper. He had known she might be tempted. He had known the house itself would provoke her. Hours passed. Sleep came and went in shallow waves until a sound split the silence, low, muffled, but unmistakable. A thud. Then another. Isabella froze. She pressed her back to the wall, listening. Footsteps staggered uneven moved down the corridor. Something scraped against the floor. A door slammed. Then nothing. She didn't breathe for a long time. When she finally did, the air was thin, sharp in her chest. The bracelet on her wrist glinted in the moonlight. A key to doors that like you, more when you're expected. But what doors open to sounds like those? She slid back beneath the covers, the note still clutched in her hand. The words burned into her as the house held its secrets around her. Do not open the door. And yet, in that moment, Isabella knew something had cracked. Not just her composure, not just her sense of safety, but the mask Lorenzo wore so well. Tomorrow, she promised herself she would find out what lay behind it. The morning sun cut through the curtains like shards of gold, but the light did nothing to ease Isabella's unease. She had slept in fragments, every creak of the mansion pulling her from the edge of rest. The note lay on the nightstand, its command still echoing, "Do not open the door." When a knock sounded, she flinched. It wasn't sharp or urgent, just 2 measured taps. She opened the door to find Matteo. His expression was harder than usual, his jaw set tight. "Breakfast is ready. Mr. De Luca requests your presence." Requests. The word carried the weight of an order. Isabella nodded, smoothing her sweater as if the gesture might steady her pulse. The dining room was quiet, save for the ticking of a clock. Lorenzo sat at the head of the table, a cup of coffee untouched before him. He was still in last night's suit, though the tie was gone, the top button undone. Shadows rimmed his eyes. He looked up as she entered. "Sit." She obeyed, lowering herself into the chair at his right. The table was laid with fruit pastries and eggs, but the air was heavy, metallic. "You didn't sleep," she said, before she could stop herself. Lorenzo studied her, his gaze unreadable. Then, without acknowledging her words, he asked, "Did you hear anything?" The question sliced through her. "So he knows. I heard—" "Noises," she admitted carefully. "Footsteps. A door. That's all." His jaw flexed. "And you stayed inside. I read your note." She let her eyes meet his. "You knew I'd be tempted." A flicker approval perhaps crossed his features. "Good." He leaned back, exhaling through his nose. "That restraint may have saved your life." The words sent a chill down her spine. She wanted to ask what had happened, who had come and gone, but the way he sipped his coffee told her he would not answer. Still she pressed. "What are you protecting me from?" He set the cup down, slow and deliberate. "From a world that doesn't forgive curiosity." Silence stretched, filled only by the clock's relentless tick. Later, wandering the east wing, Isabella discovered she was not as unseen as she thought. Servants moved quietly, avoiding her gaze. Once, she caught sight of a man in a dark suit slipping through a door she hadn't noticed before. The scent of antiseptic drifted out before it clicked shut. She followed hours later, bracelet in hand. The door resisted at first, then clicked open. Inside was a narrow corridor leading to a room lit by a single lamp. The smell was stronger here. On a leather chair sat a blood-stained jacket folded neatly. Nearby surgical instruments gleamed under the light, and on the table a basin streaked with crimson. Isabella's stomach turned. The scrape of footsteps behind her made her whip around. Lorenzo filled the doorway. His face was carved from stone, but his eyes burned. "I told you not to open doors uninvited," he said. Her throat tightened. Someone was hurt. Last night. That is none of your concern. His voice was low, dangerous. Then why am I here, Lorenzo? Why bring me into this house if I'm to pretend I don't see it bleeding? The air between them thickened. For a moment she thought he might order Matteo to drag her back upstairs. Instead, he stepped closer, so close she could see the flecks of silver in his irises. You want the truth? His voice dropped to a whisper that pressed against her bones. The truth is that every drop of blood spilled in this house is a message. And last night the message was clear. Someone dared to cross me. They won't again. Her breath caught. And if I stay, does that make me part of your message too? He studied her as though weighing whether she was fragile glass or tempered steel. At last he said, That depends on whether you break or bend. The tension between them was unbearable, fear, defiance, and something darker, sharper, threading through it. Then, without another word, he turned, leaving her in the room with the blood and the silence it left behind. Isabella sank against the table, the cold edge of metal against her palm. The mask had cracked, and behind it was not just power. It was violence raw and undeniable. And now she knew the deeper she stayed, the harder it would be to leave. The night returned with a heavier silence than before. Isabella lay awake, staring at the ceiling where shadows carved themselves into shapes she couldn't name. The memory of the blood-stained room pressed against her chest like a weight. Lorenzo's words echoed. Every drop spilled is a message. She couldn't forget the way he had looked at her like she was both a trespasser and a test. By midnight, she gave up on sleep. She wrapped a shawl over her shoulders and paced the length of her room. The mansion felt alive, listening. Then, almost as if summoned by her unrest, came the soft knock. Not the firm rhythm of Matteo, not the brisk command of a servant. This was gentler, uncertain. She opened the door. Lorenzo stood there, the hall's low light catching on the angles of his face. His tie was gone, his shirt undone at the collar. There was no veneer of perfection tonight. He looked like a man stripped to the bone. "May I?" he asked. The word startled her may instead of must. She stepped aside. He entered, moving with the quiet presence of someone who knew he belonged anywhere. Yet there was a tension in his shoulders, a heaviness in the air he carried with him. "I owe you an explanation," he said finally. Her pulse quickened. "About last night." His eyes flicked to hers, sharp, searching. "About why you're here at all." He sat not in the chair but on the edge of the desk, his posture loose in a way that made him seem more dangerous, not less. "This house," he began, "is a fortress. But a fortress is also a prison. Everyone inside pays a price, some in loyalty, some in blood." His gaze darkened. "When you stepped through my door that night, you chose without knowing it." "I didn't choose anything," Isabella whispered. "You chose to survive. And survival has its bargains." She wrapped the shawl tighter. "So what bargain do you want from me?" For the first time, hesitation flickered in his eyes. He leaned forward, voice low. "I want you to stand with me. Not as decoration. Not as a pawn. As something else." The words caught her off guard. "And if I refuse, then I protect you anyway," he said. "But protection without purpose is fragile. It will crumble the moment someone stronger demands you." Isabella's heart hammered. So I bend to you, or I break under someone else. Lorenzo didn't confirm. He didn't need to. His silence was answer enough. She stood moving closer, driven by something she didn't fully understand. And what do I gain if I accept? This time his reply came without hesitation. My name as your shield. My enemies as your enemies. My power as your weapon. The room pulsed with the gravity of it. A bargain carved in the dark. Isabella searched his face, expecting only coldness. But she found something else, weariness perhaps, or a truth he hadn't meant to let slip. What's the cost? She asked softly. His jaw tightened. The cost is that you stop being invisible. Once they know you're mine, there is no return. The words hung between them like smoke, dangerous, binding, and yet Isabella felt a strange calm settle in her bones, because beneath the fear, beneath the defiance, a thought had rooted itself. Maybe invisibility had never truly saved her. She lifted her chin. Then perhaps it's time they see me. For the first time, Lorenzo's mask fractured not with menace, but with something perilously close to admiration. He nodded once, slow and deliberate. Then it settled. The bargain had been struck. But deep down, Isabella knew bargains in the dark were never without blood. The following days unfolded like the tightening of a noose. Isabella had spoken the words that tethered her to Lorenzo, though she wasn't sure if it was courage or surrender. Now the world inside the mansion shifted around her, subtle but undeniable. The servants no longer averted their eyes. They bowed their heads as she passed, as though her shadow now carried weight. Matteo, ever the sentinel, addressed her with a quiet respect that unsettled her more than his usual sharpness. Even the guards stationed near the gates seemed to stand straighter when she walked the halls. But with acknowledgment came expectation. At breakfast, a second cup of coffee was poured without her asking. At dinner, her seat was already placed beside Lorenzo's. She had become part of the choreography of his world, visible in a way she had never been before, and visibility invited danger. It began with glass. The morning was pale sunlight fractured by the tall windows of the library. Isabella sat curled in an armchair, a book open, but unread, in her lap. Lorenzo was at the desk across the room, speaking in low tones into a phone. His voice was calm, but the muscles in his hand flexed with each word. Then came the shatter. A crack like thunder split the air as a window exploded, inward shards flying like razors. Isabella dropped to the floor, her ears ringing. Lorenzo was beside her in an instant, his arm shielding her as more glass rained down. Gunfire followed sharp and brutal chewing into the wood of the shelves. "Stay down!" he barked, dragging her behind the heavy desk. Her heart slammed against her ribs. The library, a sanctuary of books and silence, had become a battlefield. Matteo burst through the door, weapon drawn. 2 guards followed their movements, precise, efficient. Return fire cracked through the air, shouts echoing from outside, and then, as suddenly as it began, it ended. Silence pressed against Isabella's skull, broken only by the drip of shattered glass sliding from the window frame. Lorenzo stood, his gun still warm in his hand. His eyes blazed with a fury that could have set the world aflame. They dared, he muttered. The words weren't for her, they were a promise to himself. He turned crouched and cupped Isabella's face between his hands. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, though her breath came shallow and sharp. "No. Just—" She glanced at the glittering shards strewn across the floor. Shaken. His thumb brushed her cheek, the gentleness at odds with the violence still humming through his body. Good, because shaken can be steadied, broken is harder. He pulled her to her feet, guiding her past the ruins of the window. Sunlight spilled through the jagged hole, stark and merciless. By evening, the mansion had transformed. Guards patrolled the halls with heavier steps. Doors that had once stood open were locked. The air tasted of iron and gunpowder. Isabella sat across from Lorenzo in the study, the fire between them crackling too loudly. "Who was it?" she asked. "Rivals testing the edges," he said. His tone was calm, but the storm in his eyes betrayed him. "They wanted to see if the shield I promised you could break." And he leaned forward, his gaze fixed on hers. "It didn't. It won't. Not while I breathe." The firelight carved him into something both terrifying and magnetic. Isabella felt the heat of his vow settle inside her chest, mingling with fear, with defiance, with something more dangerous than either. Still she whispered, "But fire leaves scars, Lorenzo, and glass cuts deep." He didn't deny it. Instead, he reached across the table, his hand closing around hers, binding her to the truth they both knew this was only the beginning. The mansion no longer felt like a fortress. It felt like tinder waiting for a spark. Every corridor hummed with tension. Guards lingered at every threshold, weapons visible instead of hidden. Servants whispered in corners, their eyes darting to Isabella, as though she were both a symbol and a curse. She carried Lorenzo's shadow now, and it followed her through every step of the house. That night, the storm did not come from the sky, but from the gates. The first explosion rattled the windows, a blast that shook dust from the chandeliers. Isabella bolted upright from her chair in the study, heart lurching. Distant gunfire snapped through the air, followed by the rapid shouts of men. Lorenzo was already on his feet. He seized his jacket, his weapon, and for the first time since she had met him, he looked almost human. Furious, yes, but also fallible, aware of the weight pressing down. "Stay here," he ordered. "No," Isabella said, surprising herself. Her voice trembled but held. "Not this time. If I'm yours, I don't hide in the dark while the house burns." His gaze locked on hers, hard and unyielding. Yet something flickered beneath it. Recognition, perhaps even respect. He didn't argue. He only said, "Then stay close." The halls erupted into chaos. Smoke seeped through the air, bitter and acrid. The east wing roared with fire where the blast had torn through a wall. Shadows darted past allies and enemies, indistinguishable, until the flash of gunfire gave them away. Matteo appeared, blood on his sleeve, eyes sharp. "They've breached the gate. 2 cars, maybe 3. We've pushed them back, but it won't hold." "Then we make it hold," Lorenzo said. His voice was steel. "No one leaves this house alive unless I decide it." He turned to Isabella, pressing something cold into her palm. "A small pistol. If anyone gets past me, you use this. Do not hesitate." Her breath hitched, but she closed her hand around the weapon. "And if it's you—" For a fraction of a second the world fell silent. Then he leaned closer, his lips brushing her ear. If it's me, you'll know I've already lost. The fight consumed the mansion. Shattered glass underfoot, flames licking the edges of priceless paintings, bodies falling like whispers in the dark. Isabella stayed at Lorenzo's side, her pulse pounding in rhythm with each gunshot. At one point, a figure lunged from the shadow's blade flashing. Isabella lifted the pistol with shaking hands and fired. The man crumpled his knife, clattering to the marble. Her body trembled violently, but Lorenzo's hand was suddenly there, steadying her. His voice cut through the din. "Good. You chose to live." By the time the last shot echoed away, dawn was seeping through the broken windows. Smoke curled through the air, carrying the bitter scent of ash. The mansion stood scarred but unfallen. In the ruined library, where glass still glittered across the floor, Lorenzo pulled Isabella close. His suit was torn, his hands blood-stained, but his grip was unshakable. "You asked me once what the cost was," he said, his voice hoarse. "This is it. Blood, fire, ashes. To stand with me is to stand in the ruins." Isabella met his gaze. Her own reflection fractured in his gray eyes. Fear coiled in her, but so did something fiercer. She had already crossed the threshold, already stained her hands, already chosen. "Then let it burn," she whispered. "If this is the world I've stepped into, I won't look away." For the first time, Lorenzo's mask fell completely. He pressed his forehead to hers, a vow without words. Outside, the sun rose over a battlefield. Inside, Isabella understood the truth. At last, she had not just survived the storm, she had become part of it. And storms once born did not end quietly.